Okay, wonderful. We'd like to continue the conversation with Claudia Haupt, who's a professor of law and political science at Northeastern University School of Law in Boston, who, interesting side note, is going to be hosting a big conference in June for professors of health law and policy. So the floor is yours.
Excellent, thank you. I'm very happy to sort of pick up at this stage because I think we've heard a couple of sort of themes that I wanted to pick up on already articulated throughout the day, and so I feel like I'm building on what has been said so far. So commentators seem fairly confident, I think we saw that reflected here, that AI will have some sort of transformative effect on healthcare delivery, and we may be moving, and I say may because who knows where this is going, but we may be moving from computer-aided diagnosis to algorithm-generated advice. And as that happens, we see new legal questions arise. And so I want to start at the point where we are now, right? So before we can assess these changes that AI may or may not bring, we should first understand what might be different about AI in professional advice giving. And so the professional advice-giving relationship is a specific kind of social interaction. And precisely what changes occur within it depends on the type of technology used and the manner in which it is used within a traditionally human interaction. And so novel forms of professional advice-giving involving various types of technologies raise ultimately enduring questions about the nature of the provider-patient relationship. And so technological innovation in healthcare actually takes place in a densely regulated space that's dominated by asymmetries of knowledge and social relationships based on trust. And these relationships are governed by a legal framework of professional advice giving that consists of several elements. And they include professional licensing, fiduciary duties, informed consent, and malpractice liability. So I'll take that as the starting point. Now, this framework is designed to protect certain values that we associate with human-to-human professional advice giving. I guess I was too fast here. So the values, so introducing AI into this relationship challenges the assumptions that underlie the framework. I will stipulate for now, and I think this is sort of a theme that has come out earlier too, that AI does not entirely replace human professionals, at least for now. So that stipulation, though, has a key consequence from the legal perspective because the professional, at least for the time being, remains the human actor rather than the machine. Nonetheless, the question arises whether or how the regulatory framework that I've just outlined should be adapted when tech solutions, including AI, are inserted into the process of professional advice giving. So I actually would suggest that with respect to professional advice rendered by AI, and we just heard that that's just a subset of the AI that we're talking about, so I just want to be clear about the fact that it's a subset that I'm talking about. So with respect to professional advice rendered by AI, we should start with this traditional regulatory framework of professional advice giving that builds on a theory that has the doctor-patient or the provider-patient relationship at its core. So let me just put this in a larger context. So outside of the medical context, legal scholar Jack Balkin suggests that there's a rapid move underway from the age of the internet to the algorithmic society. And he defines algorithmic society as a society organized around social and economic decision-making by algorithms, robots, and AI agents who do not only make decisions, but in some cases also carry them out. And in this emerging society, he notes, we need not laws of robotics, but laws of robot operators. It's not, the central problem in this area is not the algorithms or the robots, it's the humans. It's the humans who use them and who allow themselves to be governed by them. So algorithmic governance is the governance of humans by humans using a particular technology of analysis and decision-making. Okay, so similarly, I suggest that we should likewise begin to consider algorithmic governance in the medical advice-giving context rather than assessing each AI individually in order to consider whether or how it should be regulated, I suggest we ought to first turn to the traditional regulatory framework that governs professional advice giving. Side note, just to follow up on what Nicholson just said about FDA regulation. So this is not in any way exclusive of a different approach, and as I said, advice giving itself is only a subset, so we're talking about other types of regulation. There may be space for FDA regulation as well. Now, the distinct advantage of first turning to this traditional regulatory framework is that the focus is on the social relationship rather than the technology employed in it. And so the key question then is not what is technologically possible, but what is normatively desirable. So do we actually want this rather than can we do this? Can we find somebody to program something in a way that we think is really cool? So today I want to do three things. First, I want to talk about the existing regulatory framework of professional advice giving, with an emphasis on the values underlying the professional-patient relationship. And what I want to do is emphasize or identify regulatory access points at which the legal system shapes how professional advice is dispensed, and at which the legal system seeks to ensure that the patient receives good advice from the provider. And then I want to turn to the sort of numerous and varied ways in which technology has disrupted or is likely to disrupt the process of professional advice giving. So the wide range of possible technological innovations has very different effects on the advice-giving relationship. And so, machine learning, AI that directly gives advice to patients poses the greatest challenge. But aside from that specific type of AI, the current regime, to a large extent, seems fairly responsive to existing technological innovations. So then I want to look at the range of potential legal responses to these changes at the regulatory access points that I'll identify, and focus on the normative interests. The goal of these responses is to integrate AI into the professional advice-giving relationship while at the same time upholding the values that traditionally characterize that relationship. So let me start with the values of professional advice giving. So the medical provider-patient relationship is a distinctive social interaction. The initial focus when assessing changes introduced by technology should be on the relationship between providers and patients, and the sort of the values that underlie that relationship. So let's start with competence and knowledge. So medicine historically is considered one of the paradigmatic learned professions, right? And the reason that medical professionals' advice is valuable to patients is that professionals have knowledge that their patients lack, but that is necessary for them to make important decisions about their own health. And so this knowledge asymmetry is a central feature of the professional relationship. Only accurate, comprehensive advice will enable the patient to make a fully informed decision. So from the patient's perspective, a central value is the reliability of advice. And the legal system employs a range of mechanisms that ensure that the needs of the patient are served. So before professionals may dispense advice to their clients or patients, they're generally subject to licensing by the state. We've seen, more recently, we've seen a range of attacks on professional licensing. I think it's worth remembering that professional advice does require a certain degree of knowledge. And so licensing properly calibrated is in fact a useful mechanism to signal ex ante the reliability of expert advice. Now, so far, technology has often been applied without licensing or certification as long as it was supervised by a human. And presumably where professional use AI is supervised by a human professional, those professionals would be licensed. But then what does that mean for their qualifications regarding the supervision of AI? Right, that's a different question. So consider a licensed physician who's otherwise technology illiterate, tasked with the supervisory function. So supervision of AI is only useful if the supervisor is qualified to do so. Once licensed, the professional is also subject to professional discipline. Another way that the current regulatory framework ensures that patients receive good advice from their providers is through protecting the speech within the professional-patient relationship. So this is particularly relevant to guard against outside interference, most likely by state legislatures who try to tell doctors what they can say to their patients, that contradicts professional insights. Now, whether traditional First Amendment doctrine applies to AI is subject to debate, but I would suggest that with respect to professional speech, the answer hinges on the social context, right, the provider-patient relationship, in which the speech occurs. That there's only, unlike other speakers, professionals are actually constrained in many ways in what they may say. And most importantly, bad professional advice, that is, advice inconsistent with the range of knowledge that's accepted by the relevant professional knowledge communities, is subject to malpractice liability. And the First Amendment provides no defense, right? So you can't say, doctor can't say, I'm free to give you bad advice, because free speech. So competence, that's competence and knowledge. So then we have trust. So the provider-patient relationship on the one hand is characterized by this asymmetry of knowledge, and it's also a relationship based on trust. And here we have fiduciary duties that address the knowledge asymmetries between professionals and clients and patients, creating these twin duties of loyalty and care. So the patient entrusts the medical professionals with providing guidance regarding important health decisions, and in return, the provider must act in the patient's best interest and according to the knowledge of the profession. So this is one way that the legal framework of advice giving aims to ensure that patients receive good advice is to ask about this trust as a matter of fiduciary duties. And another is to look at the same question with respect to the existence of a regime of professional malpractice liability. And I'll look at that next. Both aim to ensure that trust in the professional is met by their behavior. So this is responsibility, right? Professional malpractice liability enforces the provider's responsibility for the outcome. There's a human provider who's responsible for the outcome. Now, the standard in medical malpractice is customary care. So this obviously poses a challenge for innovation, which presumably is not yet custom. But the tension between liability and innovation actually has a long history in tort law, where even in areas in which custom determines the standard of care, courts have acknowledged progress and demanded that it's incorporated into the liability standard. So this is where I teach my tort students a famous case about tugboats and why they're required to have radios, which was a brand new technology at the time. But then you see where this is going. But then if the professional malpractice standard is determined by the practice of the profession, what's the appropriate standard for AI? So that's responsibility. Next, we come to ethics. So there's an emerging drive towards the professional ethics of AI with all the associated problems, such as agreement on what it should be, and then, of course, questions of enforceability. In the medical context, though, we're dealing with an existing ethical framework. So when AI is deployed in a space dominated by a traditional ethical framework, such as the ethics of a self-regulated profession, I would suggest that the agreement upon them, as well as the enforcement mechanisms, are already in place, and so professional AI must be embedded into the existing ethical framework that applies to that profession. Right? Contrast that with a question we had earlier about sort of a regulatory body for all forms of AI. So I would suggest that we have a much more fine-grained approach if we look at the context in which AI is embedded. So to summarize thus far, we should think about AI and professional advice giving as embedded into the regulatory framework that likewise governs human professional advice. It's possible that the framework needs improvement, and thinking about the role of AI lets us reassess the existing framework. It's also possible that there must be adaptations to the existing framework due to the specific nature of AI, but what should guide our reassessment are the values underlying the regulatory framework, regardless of who's the advice giver. All right, so let's look at the role of technology. So this is a rough sketch of the legal framework surrounding advice. Now let's look at the role of technology. So the traditional professional client or doctor-patient or healthcare provider-patient relationship assumes at its core the personal connection between a professional and a client. And the introduction of technology of whatever form, including AI, replaces the professional or adds another element to the relationship. And so I think at the outset, it's useful to distinguish among the broad range of available technologies and their potential uses. Some technological interventions will challenge the advice-giving framework more than others, right? And so machine learning AI that directly dispenses advice to the patient without provider mediation most likely presents a challenge. But other technologies that are frequently discussed under the umbrella of AI are less likely to significantly disrupt the regulatory framework. So I would say AI-guided robotic-assisted surgery doesn't really cause that much of a disruption. So I first want to take a brief look at patient-facing technologies. And I want to highlight very quickly the types of tech, sort of from less challenging to more challenging from a legal perspective. And then I'll turn to professional use AI. So before I start on the patient-facing applications, though, I just want to make a general point. So we live in an area of unprecedented access to information. And that puts vast amounts of data at our fingertips. And across, access to the internet is widespread and relatively inexpensive. And yet, for the most part, all the available information doesn't really give patients the expert knowledge necessary to cure their own illnesses. At the same time, however, the abundance of information that we can receive at any point in time influences the role of the professional whose advice we continue to seek. So web-based professional advice platforms represent probably the most basic version of this. So the online advice giving that most users will be familiar with is sort of like a WebMD type thing. And the fundamental problem here is the difference between information and knowledge. The client or patient still needs the professional to interpret the information and apply it to her specific problem. And this has two immediate results. The client or patient places less reliance on the professional as a source of information, and at the same time expects a higher level of qualification from the expert. But it's not access to information that we're so much concerned about. So what distinguishes the layperson from the professional is that the professional is able to do something with the information. And consequently, the patient expects a higher degree of specialization and expertise of the professional. So in the end, the central innovation is availability and accessibility of information. Of course, the same information can be found in books and journals, right? But the web platform just makes the information more easily available. But it doesn't fundamentally challenge the way that professional advice is rendered. The same is largely true for the telemedicine model, right? If you think about both the telemedicine model and sort of now it's extended into app-based advice. So for example, take a therapy app that connects users with therapists, and their sessions can be text or video-based. Because of the app format, questions regarding the nature of the professional relationship have been raised that suggests somewhat of a departure from the traditional telemedicine setup. So how much is the interaction between clinician and patient dictated by the app? Who controls access to patient records? Is the patient anonymous? What does it mean to be a licensed therapist providing app-based therapy? And then you have, sort of as a legal matter, the lack of face-to-face contact. So this might look less like a traditional provider-patient relationship with its attendant legal duties. But even if it's less obvious, such a relationship may be implied, right? And legal questions so far focused on telemedicine. If you consider it sort of cyber advice, app-based stuff, that's, I think, sufficiently analogous. So then if you go, this is going from the least to the most challenging. A further development is connecting AI to personal assistants. So this is It's likely that users might initially consult Alexa for medical issues. The advice dispensed may delay treatment, right? It may suggest wrong diagnosis, otherwise have negative effects. Actually, some of my colleagues at Northeastern are doing some interesting research on that. It's really remarkable what kind of medical advice Alexa gives. And so the user's reliance on advice dispensed by Alexa may be affected in some way by the interactive nature of this relationship, right? So whereas if you say you take WebMD, you have larger amounts of information that are sort of displayed at the same time, whereas if you talk to Alexa, the initial answer might be understood by the listener as the correct answer without sort of a longer unfolding list of caveats of all of the things that this could also be. Okay, so that's patient-facing. Now we have professional use algorithms and AI. So healthcare professionals, of course, have incorporated various forms of technology into clinical practice for really the last century. And one avenue of incorporating algorithmic decision support is through clinical decision support programs that can assist with the implementation of evidence-based guidelines. So a provider feeds patient data into an algorithm that compares the data with an intervention threshold, and the result is a real-time recommendation for intervention where the evidence-based guidelines or other medical research provide the source of rules applied by the algorithm. But it's the physician's decision to decide whether to intervene according to the recommendation or to even look at them, as we heard earlier. We might just as well turn them off and ignore them. So, and there's a body of research on that I'll just gesture towards. The technological innovation here, though, lies in the clinical decision support program's real-time recommendations. Right? The output can be considered advice-giving, but the underlying explanation can be found in the guidelines or the literature itself. In addition to being explainable, the output is then filtered through the individual professional who may or may not follow the advice, or may not even look at it. And in that sense, the ultimate decision on whether to incorporate the output into professional advice still lies with the human professional. So from a legal perspective, this is fairly straightforward. Now contrast that with machine learning AI outputs, which are increasingly used in some parts of clinical practice. So the most promising features are the technology strengths and pattern recognition learned from enormous training data sets that we already heard about that are much larger than what human professionals can process. And so we've seen the most rapid changes in image-intensive fields, right? So we've heard about radiology, pathology, dermatology, and others. And we've heard already that sometimes their performance outperforms that of clinicians. So based on the big data inputs, the characteristic of machine learning is an accumulation of information that generates opaque outputs that the professional can incorporate into advice without understanding how exactly they were generated. This is what we've already heard about. And machine learning, contrary to human interpretation, is able to identify patterns. It doesn't matter, it doesn't matter if it's precancerous moles or if it's fraud patterns in huge data sets of financial data. The AI doesn't really care. But the point is that it's without explanation. I should flag that there's a literature on automation bias and the larger problem of deprofessionalization by tech. And so I think this morning already heard a little bit about that. So computer-aided detection systems, say in radiology, may result in only cursory review of the outputs. So for a lesser skilled professional, the computer-aided detection will improve results, but this may come at the expense of de-skilling highly expert readers in finding the tricky cases, so they may become too reliant on tech and miss certain results. So really maintaining a certain skeptical posture may be advisable, which is really the same as with any other lab or test results. So let's look at the legal responses. So the regulatory framework governing professional advice giving should be designed to ensure the protection of these values underlying the healthcare provider relationship that I talked about at the outset. That the professional the professional communicates accurate and comprehensive advice to the patient according to the current state of the knowledge community standards, that the professional's advice is personally tailored to the situation of the client, that as the fiduciary duty demands, the professional serves the patient's best interests, and that if the professional fails to meet the professional standard in advice giving, she's liable for the resulting harm. Now, this means that the discussion of the potential legal responses mirrors the values that I've discussed at the outset. So these are the regulatory access points at which the legal system aims to ensure that patients receive accurate, comprehensive professional advice. So let me start where I ended on skills. So professional licensing and expertise, right? Some commentators note that the real transformative potential lies in combining technological advances with lower skill requirements. So understood, a larger number of lesser skilled individuals deliver services in a more convenient, less expensive way. In order to realize that potential in the health context, we need to rethink licensing. This would incentivize tech companies to support expanding the scope of practice laws in favor of a broad range of providers, right? So nurse practitioners, physician assistants. It might be worth pointing out that such an expansion of providers might be a good idea even absent technological innovation. So I've written in a recent article that this retailoring of professional licensing would not actually open the market to unlicensed providers, but rather expands the market of licensed professionals. And I should also add that, that healthcare is actually much more advanced on this than, say, the legal profession. Now, in terms of existing licensing regimes, we should also take into account that some degree of technical literacy is necessary, although the level of understanding of the technology employed may vary among professionals, and it may not be clinicians who need the highest level of technical understanding. So in my notes, I actually have team question marks, so this goes back to the earlier discussion about how teamwork makes the team work. I know that was on purpose. All right, so then we get to fiduciary duties. So the twin duties of trust and care that are based on the fiduciary relationship between professional and client may shift depending on whether the trust continues to be placed in the human professional. Right, so we said that the primary knowledge asymmetry right now is between provider and patient. The primary knowledge asymmetry may end up being no longer between professional and client or provider and patient, but between AI and patient, or even between AI and provider. Then we have malpractice liability. So this connects to another, perhaps even more important change that results from introducing AI into the professional relationship. So we already talked a little bit about opacity. So opacity as to the decisions that AI makes, which raises new questions about transparency, explainability, and the like of the AI's recommendations. So can there be liability if the physician relies on the algorithm? Is it enough to just know that the algorithm is accurate and reliable without explainability? The technical reality of AI makes this opacity a particularly salient problem, and while scholars tend to emphasize that straightforward explainability would be preferable, the healthcare context might actually be less likely to allow for that explainability. So especially in the clinical context, some warn against overemphasizing explainability. And I should add, because I'm in St. Louis, that was one of the points that somebody made last year when I presented this paper at the law school. Why certain medical treatments work is less explainable than we might think. Maybe not to you, but certainly from a legal perspective. So then the question is, what is the black box? Is it in clinical practice? Is it the algorithm or is it just the human body? And then the question is whether we have a higher standard for AI explainability than for human clinical practice. But custom and malpractice regimes addresses this issue to some degree. So if a professional standard has developed around certain treatments, but the treatments themselves are not at all or only partially explainable, again, perhaps not to you, but to a lawyer, custom will nonetheless provide a shield against liability. So then we have informed consent. Here we might think about a specialized informed consent requirement depending on the technology employed, and opacity also seems to be an initial obstacle. But, so what are you consenting to? How are you informed if nobody knows how this works? But a comparison with traditional clinical practice, again, reveals that the problem might not be as detrimental to the continued relevance of informed consent as it might seem. It's not really that different from how we think about informed consent now. And then finally, we have professional ethics. So one benefit some see in combining AI, this is actually also something that already came up. One benefit some see in combining AI with wearables is the sort of ongoing patient participation, as well as remote monitoring, digital advice giving, that would replace sort of the intermittent data collection and interpretation in clinical practice. The negative version of that statement, of course, is constant patient surveillance. Proponents of this model would argue that there are concerns, but this would give physicians more time to focus on the tasks that are uniquely human, so building relationships, exercising empathy, using human judgment to guide and advise. But that vision at least implicitly assumes that professional ethics continue to operate. We're just not very clear on how that works, and so that's a challenge that is raised in this area. So to conclude, advances in AI are finding their way into healthcare delivery, which is a densely regulated space in which the law has to ensure the integrity of the doctor-patient relationship. So it's essential to remember that behind the algorithms are social relationships between human beings. The healthcare provider-patient relationship is a specific social relationship. The starting point for regulating AI within this relationship should be the values that define it. And despite aggressive claims to novelty, not all potential uses of medical AI raise fundamentally new legal problems. So to the extent that the existing regulatory framework is responsive to these changes, it ought to be kept in place. Where the introduction of AI into medical advice giving changes the dynamics of the relationship in a way that threatens the underlying values, new regulatory responses may become necessary. So ultimately, the underlying social relationship between healthcare provider and patient, rather than the technology employed in it, should guide the legal response to innovation in this space. The editors promise that the article that goes with this will be out soon. If you can't wait, there's a draft available, and I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
So to the extent that the kind of professionalism side on this relies on action by, say, medical boards and entities like that, do you think they're up for the job?
The medical boards?
Yeah.
In terms of licensing?
Yeah, licensing, discipline, that sort of stuff. Do you think that this is within their wheelhouse?
You just want me to say FDA, right? I see where this is going. I mean, we'll have to think about where the best sort of locus of expertise is. The medical boards generally could be doing a much better job at implementing knowledge rather than spending their time, or at, ensuring that knowledge is at their focus rather than spending time on all sorts of other things. I don't think that that's a particularly sort of AI-centric issue. So, if you look at disciplinary matters that come up, they have to do with, this is true for doctors, this is also true for lawyers. They're interested in a whole range of things, but ensuring expertise
Right.
is not as much of an emphasis as I would like it to be. And so this actually gets to, like a helpful segue to another observation, which is the introduction of AI into these traditional relationships prompts us to rethink the way that we've done things in the past. So as much as it is useful to think about, forward-looking, how are we going to deal with this, it also lets us re-examine the way we've done things in the past. And so this might be a good opportunity to re-examine the role of disciplinary boards and licensing authorities.
I really like the focus in your talk on the relationship, because often that gets lost in the discussion of AI and what it can do or what it is doing.
Right.
What I think is interesting is trying to apply that to the legal frameworks that we already have, like informed consent was one that you mentioned. It seems like there's some knowledge gaps there. We don't know how patients feel about the use of AI,
Right.
and therefore we don't know if it's something that's important enough that needs to be disclosed in all cases. There isn't a system in place to tell patients if it's disclosed. If your physician agrees, does it have to be disclosed? If they don't, does it?
Right.
We don't know that sort of information that would help us better fit it into our existing structures.
Right.
And I think without assessment of AI in a specific context, we really can't even tell a patient that it's better.
Yeah.
In many cases.
Right, right. Well, and this goes to a development we've seen in the law of informed consent over time, where it was much more physician-centered, right? It was very provider-centered, sort of what the provider thinks is relevant, to a much more patient-centric, what does the patient think is material information that needs to be disclosed. And so I think it's right to, again, consider the way that we've done things in the past and reconsider how we might change it in the future. And so there's a big area for social science research to just sort of get an empirical basis of how do patients feel about this? How much do they want to know? Are their expectations about what they want to know about AI, exceeding their expectations about other forms of treatment? So it's very possible that a patient would want to know all of the whys about every treatment. And like I said, in clinical practice, some of the pushback against the opacity problem I got from clinicians was, we don't know why certain things work. And so here I think the danger is to set the expectation on the AI side too high and sort of demand more than what we would demand in other contexts. So this is the same with liability for self-driving cars, right? This is a theme that we see throughout. Do we demand more safety from a self-driving car than from a human driver? It turns out human drivers are really not great.
Yes, yeah. I think part of the challenge, though, is you can't answer those questions.
Yeah, I think that's
If a patient wanted to, and not all do, you could ask your physician, like, well, why did you decide treatment A or B?
Right, and there's
you
no
can't answer that question
That's
for
right.
AI, so there
That's
can't be the dialogue, even if that is something that is desired in that relationship.
That's exactly right. And then I would draw the analogy to, we don't know why drug X works well, but it just has become custom that if you don't offer this treatment, you fall below the standard of care. Can everybody explain to you why exactly this works? Probably not. But once it becomes custom, that's legally at least not the relevant question anymore.
Jason.
I hope everyone can stay to the very last session, because Jim Dubois and Allison Antis are going to present some patient views. Maybe not those views that you're after, but some views. And I can't wait. It's original research that's never been presented before. The second thing is the spring event for the Bander Center. One of the three is going to center on physician clinical competency and certification. And so I want to carry forth Nicholson's question to that. And then did you say a potential fiduciary duty of AI to the patient? something like that?
No.
Or do you want to say
So
that right now?
I do not,
Did
I
you
do
say
not
that?
want
Did
to
I
say,
miss
I do not want to say that. So the fiduciary model is very interesting, and I don't think that we can sensibly conceptualize fiduciary duties, which is loyalty, care, as a basis for trust with the AI. What we could do is think a little harder about a thing that some of my colleagues and mentors call information fiduciary. So this is Jonathan Zittrain at Harvard and Jack Balkin at Yale, who've been developing this concept. What that means is we take something like fiduciary duties and apply it to platforms. This is not just in the medical context. This is sort of platforms more broadly. We give them all of our information. We give them all of our data, and we have no idea what they do with it. And so maybe we should impose something that looks like fiduciary duties on them to at least keep them from using our own information against us. And so, but that would be sort of a constraining mechanism around the technology, around the platforms. It's not that, and I should also say, sort of against interest, that while they build this model on the professional model, I actually think that professionals are the wrong fiduciaries. So not all fiduciaries are professionals, and not all professionals are fiduciaries. I don't think that information fiduciaries are like professionals. I think they may be more like trustees and beneficiaries. And what's missing is this, this expertise component. It's the expertise that the patient trusts that underlies the fiduciary relationship between doctor and patient. And tech platforms don't have that expertise, right? They're the forum in which we throw all of our data. But it's not because of a knowledge asymmetry or an expertise asymmetry. So something like fiduciaries, but not that the AI themselves are fiduciaries.
Hi, thank you. Could you say a bit more about the difference between medical advice and just perhaps information giving, particularly with respect to patients interacting directly with an AI, and the effect of patient reliance or the intent of whoever's providing the AI or disclaimers? I'd be interested in understanding that a little better.
Yeah, so that's actually a really fascinating area because, so on the one hand, we have this sort of this is completely untech related kind of distinction between, well, what's information and what's knowledge. And so if you go back to the origins of sort of the learned professions, right, and the idea of self-regulation and all of that, there's something qualitatively different about knowledge than about information. So there's a giant body of literature, of course, in the sociology of the professions about what that thing is. I actually think that in part it is you can use information to apply it to a specific situation. You have a patient with a specific problem. You have a range of information at your disposal, and you're trained to apply that information to this specific instance. And so that's kind of the core of what expertise would be in that area. It's different for other professions. One of the distinguishing features is that professions have a shared way of knowing and reasoning about the underlying information. So I think sort of at the core, it's a qualitative difference between one and the other. That then leads to, well, what if we just give, quote unquote, lay people access to all of the information? And we've basically done that, right? I mean, you just ask Google and you can get an answer for pretty much anything. But so to be flip about it, Dr. Google isn't really your doctor. And why is that? And that's, again, this distinction between information and knowledge. And so one of the problems I see with direct interactions between AI advice givers and patients is that this qualitative difference gets lost. And so if you do look at these interactions between Alexa as an advice giver and patients, there's so much misunderstanding, there's so much lack of tailoring, there's so much lack of calibration to that specific situation, and it's the completely acontextual nature of it too. So we talked about this too a little earlier about the sort of it's the alien, right? This makes no sense to any human being who's ever been in a situation like that, but the AI doesn't know the difference or doesn't discern the context. And so I think that's information and knowledge, and also acontextualism are some of the core problems in this area.
Okay, let's have one more question.
I think this will be quick because I think you just answered it, but it occurs to me, do you ever see a place for AI in the legal profession?
Oh, there are a lot of books being written about that.
Yeah.
You know, it's interesting. There are some repetitive tasks that I think Nicholson would put under automating drudgery that actually have been, I would think that the firms would say successfully outsourced from associates to AI. As a law professor, I'm not super happy about that, but yeah. So there is a sense in which this is already happening in the legal profession as well. But again, if we get to the expertise, sort of advice-giving part of it, sort of a higher level of interaction than the just automating drudgery part, we start to see exactly the same problems, I think, as in the medical context.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.